I want to share a piece of my soul with you, a story that marked my childhood and still lives in my heart. It's the story of how, in the darkest moments of my life, when I felt like the world was crumbling around me, a little cat appeared and became my light, my hope, and my reason to keep going. I was 8 years old, but I felt like I had already lived too much. I grew up in an old trailer on the outskirts of the city, a place where loneliness was louder than the wind rattling the windows. That year was a dark one for me. My parents, always fighting, finally decided to get a divorce, and in the middle of their constant war, my grandmother, the only person who truly understood me, passed away. She was my safe haven, the one who knew how to make me feel heard and loved. When she died, it felt like the world crumbled beneath my feet. My parents didn't know how to deal with me. It's not that they didn't love me, but they seemed more focused on winning their arguments than noticing my sadness. To them, my pain wasn't important, or maybe they just didn't know how to face it. Their way of helping was to be stricter, impose more rules, and make sure my grief didn't become an inconvenience for them. One rainy night, when it felt like the sky was crying with me, I found him. He was curled up under the trailer, soaked and trembling. A tiny orange kitten, barely a baby, with the biggest, most expressive eyes I had ever seen. His faint meow blended with the sound of the rain. I crouched down, reached out my hands, and as if he knew I needed him as much as he needed me, he jumped into my arms. I named him Whiskers. I wasn't very creative, but those long, messy whiskers made me smile for the first time in weeks. That night, I hid him in my room, wrapped in an old towel. I gave him a little milk from the fridge and stayed up until he stopped trembling. The next morning, when my dad saw him, he was furious. "That thing can't stay here," he said. "Animals are a mess. Get it out." My mom didn't say anything. She always preferred to avoid conflict. They made me leave him outside in the rain. But that night, after my parents fell asleep, I opened the back door quietly and let him back in. Whiskers always came back. No matter how many times they threw him out, he always found his way back. My dad grew angrier every time. "Why does it keep coming back? That cat doesn't belong here." But I knew the answer, even if I didn't dare to say it out loud. Whiskers wasn't just any cat. Every time I looked at him, I felt something special. There was something warm and protective in his gaze. I started to believe, with the certainty only a child could have, that my grandmother had sent him to me. It was as if she, from somewhere I couldn't understand, had found a way to stay with me and make sure I wasn't alone. Whiskers wasn't just a cat. He was my hope. While my parents argued and ignored me, he was there. When I felt so small and insignificant that it seemed the world might swallow me whole, he would jump into my lap, purr, and make me feel like I still mattered. But my dad didn't understand. The next time he found Whiskers inside, he took him and left him several miles from the trailer. That night, I cried myself to sleep, convinced he would never return. But the next morning, when I opened the door to leave for school, there he was, sitting in the rain as if he had never left. He was stubborn just like me. But more than that, Whiskers was a fighter. As if he knew that my broken heart needed him to keep going. After that time when my father left Whiskers far from the trailer, I thought I had lost him forever. But when I saw him return, wet and exhausted, something shifted inside me. Despite being so small, that kitten taught me not to give up in the face of adversity. If he could find his way back after being cast aside and ignored, I could also find a way to move forward. My parents' divorce was a hurricane that destroyed what little stability I had left. They never told me anything directly, as if I wouldn't understand what was happening, but I could see it in their yelling, their fights, and the slamming doors. I felt like no one wanted to take care of me. My mom grew more distant with each passing day. She always said she had to work or needed time for herself. My dad, on the other hand, seemed overwhelmed by his own frustration, clinging to alcohol and his strict rules. I was trapped in a world I didn't understand. There were nights when I cried myself to sleep, feeling an emptiness so vast it seemed to swallow me whole. Sometimes I thought that if I disappeared, no one would even notice. My heart was shattered, and the loneliness felt like an unbearable weight. But Whiskers was there. Whenever the sadness became too much, he would appear as if by magic. He would curl up on my lap, purring softly, as if telling me I wasn't alone. Sometimes, he would touch my face with his tiny paw, as if he knew I was crying. His presence comforted me in a way that nothing and no one else could. There were days when, even in the depths of my depression, he managed to make me smile. When he played with a little ball of paper or got tangled in the curtains for a moment, I forgot my pain. It was as if he absorbed a bit of my sorrow each time he was near. With him, I could talk without fear. I told him how I felt, my fears and my anger, and though he couldn't answer, he looked at me with those big, warm eyes that seemed to say, "I understand. You're not alone." But time didn't stop. One day, my mom simply left. She kissed me on the forehead, said she had to work far away, and left me with my dad. I didn't cry when she left. I had no tears left for her. I felt betrayed, abandoned. I thought maybe I just wasn't enough for anyone to want to stay with me. Living with my dad wasn't easy. His discipline became a prison. Everything had to be perfect. My room spotless, my homework flawless, every minute of my day planned. And when things didn't go the way he wanted, alcohol became his escape and his excuse. He didn't hit me, but his words sometimes hurt more than any blow could. "You're just like your mother, always dreaming about nonsense," he would say. In that chaos, Whiskers was my only constant. No matter how much my dad despised him, I found ways to keep him close. When my dad was in a bad mood and threw Whiskers out of the house, I would sneak him back in through my bedroom window. Whiskers always knew when I needed comfort, and his purring became the melody that soothed my wounded soul. There was one night when I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. I was broken, as if the weight of my life was crushing me. I sat on the floor of my room, hugging my knees, crying silently so I wouldn't wake my dad. That's when Whiskers jumped onto my lap, looked at me intently, and purred louder than ever. I stroked him, and I felt my breathing slow. I whispered to him, "Thank you for not leaving me." Whiskers wasn't just a cat. He was the thread holding together what was left of my heart. In a world determined to break me, he was my refuge, my comfort, my hope. And even though life with my dad was never easy, I always knew that as long as Whiskers was with me, I could find the strength to keep going. The day my life changed forever came like an unexpected thunderclap. My father, in one of his alcohol-fueled fits of rage, committed a crime no one could ignore. I didn't understand the details. Words like assault, arrest, and prison floated around me, heavy and incomprehensible. I remember the police sirens, the shouting, and the silence that followed, a void that seemed to swallow everything. I had no one else. My mother was far away, lost in her own world, and there were no other relatives who could take care of me. The solution arrived in the form of a social worker who spoke with a kindness that couldn't hide the sadness in her eyes. "We'll take you to the city orphanage," she said. Her voice was soft, but the words hit me like stones. But the worst part came later. "You can't take the cat with you," she added. My heart shattered into pieces, so small, I thought they'd never come back together. Whiskers had been my one constant, my friend, my safe haven. How could I leave him behind? That last night with him was the most painful of my life. I stayed awake until late, with Whiskers curled up in my lap, as I wrote a letter I knew he could never read but felt I had to write. Every word was a piece of my soul spilled onto the paper. "Dear Whiskers," I wrote, tears falling onto the page, smudging the ink. "I know you can't read this, but I want you to know how much you mean to me. You have been my light in the darkness, my friend when I had no one, and my hope when I thought all was lost. I don't know how I'll live without you, but I want you to understand it's not, because I don't love you. I love you more than words can ever express." The paper was so wet with tears I worried he wouldn't be able to understand my handwriting, if by some magical chance he ever could read it. But I kept writing, needing him to know everything. "Thank you for staying with me through the hardest times. Thank you for your purrs when my soul was broken, and for the laughs you gave me when I thought I'd never smile again. Now I have to leave, and I can't take you with me, but I want you to know I will never, ever forget you. This is a new beginning for me, a new world where I hope to find peace, though I will miss you every single day. I hope you find someone who will love you as much as I do. When I finished, I carefully folded the letter and took it to the base of the tree where we always played. I dug a small hole with my trembling hands and buried it there, as if the act could seal my feelings in the place where we'd always be together, even if only in my memories. Whiskers followed me the entire time, watching me with those eyes full of love and understanding. I stroked his head one last time, trying to imprint that moment into my heart. "Goodbye, Whiskers," I whispered, feeling the words tear through my soul. He purred softly, as if he understood what was happening, as if he was telling me it would be okay. The next day, they took me to the orphanage. I looked out the car window as the trailer, the tree, and Whiskers disappeared from view. It felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind, but I also knew, deep in my heart, that Whiskers had fulfilled his mission. Now, a new world stretched out before me. A world that, though unknown, promised to be different. I told myself I had to be strong, not just for me but for him, because he had taught me to fight, to find hope even in the darkest moments. And though I never saw Whiskers again, I always felt that a part of him lived inside me, purring softly whenever I needed to remember that I wasn't alone. Thank you for listening to my story. This is the first time I've shared it openly, and I felt like I needed to get it out and share it with someone. If this story touched your heart, I'd really appreciate it if you could like it and share it. That way, more people going through something similar can feel identified and encouraged to share their own experiences, so they know they're not alone. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of my content. May God bless you, and thank you for your support.